by far the weakest of all iterations of Final Fantasy.
To attack Dawntrail, to go up from the
It's not an exaggeration to say that Dawntrail is Final Fantasy XIV's most divisive expansion. From day one, it's been swarmed with discourse, with opinions split straight down the middle. People either love it, or they despise it. And because of this, perceptions surrounding the expansion have become somewhat blurred, with those who love it unable to see its flaws, while those that hate it refuse to accept its triumphs. The end result is that any genuine discussion around Dawntrail has become almost impossible. So, what's the truth? Is Dawntrail as bad as people make it out to be? Or is the hate overblown? Well, to answer that, we need to look past the noise and actually examine what Dawntrail gets right and where it truly falls short. Before Dawntrail's release, there was a clear effort by Yoshi P to temper player expectations, particularly around the story. Time and time again, he emphasized that the tone and stakes would be fundamentally different from what Final Fantasy XIV players had grown used to. We weren't saving the world this time, we were taking a break. We were, in his words, going on a summer vacation. And structurally that made sense. Dawntrail wasn't meant to be a payoff, it was meant to be a beginning, a new chapter designed to establish a setting, a conflict, and a direction for the story moving forward. In that way, Dawntrail was always positioned to be the next A Realm Reborn, an expansion focused on building a foundation. The problem is that while that kind of setup is vital for telling a strong, cohesive narrative, it's also often the least engaging experience for players in the moment. World building is rarely appreciated as it happens. Its value only truly emerges in retrospect, once the full picture is visible and the payoffs are clear. That's why Realm Reborn is looked upon more fondly today. Its strengths only became apparent once players could see what it was building toward. Dawntrail, unfortunately, doesn't have that luxury. And as a result, it can only be judged by what it delivers in the present, without the benefit of hindsight. Which meant Dawntrail was starting from a deficit, telling a story that, by its very nature, wouldn't resonate with a large portion of the player base, even before the quality of the story was considered. If there's one word that best describes Dawntrail's narrative, it's disjointed. The expansion attempts to tell two separate stories. The first is the Rite of Succession, an arc that just feels less like a compelling narrative and more like a justification for getting players to the continent in the first place. The second is The Dome, a story that clearly builds towards the future of Final Fantasy XIV, with a stronger sense of direction and thematic intent. The contrast between these two is stark, so much so that even during Dawntrail's initial release, the prevailing sentiment was that the story improved dramatically around the halfway point, once the Rite of Succession concluded and the narrative shifted towards Solution 9. Which raises an obvious question: why was the Rite of Succession so wildly disliked? There are several answers: low stakes, uneven pacing, and a number of logical inconsistencies. But for many players, the single biggest issue centered on one character. A character whose presence didn't just weaken the Rite of Succession, but actively disrupted the story around them. Wook Lamont. In the lead up to Dawntrail, 3 characters were positioned as major players in the expansion: Erinvale, Kryl, and of course Wook Lamont. Players entered Dawntrail expecting these characters to be expanded upon, to learn who they were, what they wanted, and how they fit into the future of Final Fantasy XIV. That, however, isn't what happened. In practice, Erinvale, Kryl, and nearly every other character were pushed into the background by Wook Lamont. She didn't just take the spotlight, she consumed it. Willamette speaks significantly more than any other character in the expansion. Her name is the most frequently spoken word in the entire script, and even when another character is given the opportunity to speak, the conversation almost inevitably circles back to her. The consequences of this singular focus are clear. Because Willamette was given so much time, others simply weren't. As a result, much of the remaining cast feels either underdeveloped or rushed. Nowhere is this more apparent than with the primary antagonists of The Rite of Succession, Zerulja and Bakojaja, both central to the arc, yet have fewer lines of dialogue than Mablu, a minor side character. With so little time devoted to developing them, their eventual payoffs don't feel earned. Instead, players are asked to accept what they're told, rather than what they're shown. The end result isn't just a weaker supporting cast, it's a growing resentment towards Willamette herself. On paper, one might assume that dedicating more time to a character would naturally improve audience perception. In reality, the opposite can occur. While time allows for growth, it also magnifies a character's strengths and weaknesses, and the longer a character remains in focus, the more pronounced those traits become. When a character is as oversaturated as Willamette, players eventually reach a breaking point. Those who connect with her are pulled in more deeply, and those who don't are pushed away entirely. This polarization is further intensified by the way Willamette is characterized. Her energetic nature, youthful naivety, and bravado are traits that can be endearing in moderation, but become far more divisive when placed at the center of nearly every scene. Because her presence is constant, those traits are never given space to breathe. What might have been an inoffensive or even charming character in a more balanced narrative instead becomes one defined by extremes rather than nuance. And this inevitably shapes how players experience the story, because Willamette becomes the primary lens through which it is filtered, which leads directly to another core problem. For most of Final Fantasy XIV's history, the Warrior Light has functioned as the narrative's anchor. While the characters step into the spotlight as their stories develop, the player character consistently maintains a clear role, purpose, and sense of agency within the larger narrative. Dawntrail breaks from that pattern. Rather than driving events, the Warrior of Light is largely positioned as support, present, but rarely central to the story's emotional or thematic momentum. Our involvement is often reactionary rather than proactive. We intervene when conflicts escalate, resolve threats that others cannot, and then recede back into the background. In effect, the Warrior of Light functions less like a protagonist and more like a supporting character in Willamette's story. And given how deeply invested players are in their character's journey, that shift in perspective doesn't just feel different, it feels alienating. And as a result, many conflicts feel artificial, not because they're unsolvable, but because the narrative actively restrains the one character capable of resolving them. The story isn't asking whether the Warrior of Light can act, but insisting that they can't, because this isn't their story to lead. That tension further compounds the growing resentment towards both Dawntrail's narrative structure and Willamette's role within it. And all of these issues are most prominent during the Rite of Succession. By design, the arc is structured as a competition between several key figures. Yet, we spend almost no time with any of them outside of Willamette. As a result, we gain very little insight into who these characters actually are. We're told their goals, but shown very little of their motivations. This lack of development severely undercuts their eventual payoffs, leaving them feeling underdeveloped, rushed, or both. In the worst cases, major story beats can only occur because the Warrior of Light doesn't act. Not because they can't, but because the story needs them not to. It's only as the story moves into the second half that some of these problems begin to ease. Willamette remains the central focus, but other characters are at least given some room to breathe, such as Zerulja, Sphene, Kryl, and Erenvel. Their arcs still do feel rushed, But these shifting perspectives provide a reprieve that was largely absent in the first half. Combined with the higher stakes and core concept of the Dome storyline, the narrative gains a clearer sense of direction, making it far more engaging overall. And while this half of the story still has its failures, they aren't present to the same degree. Pacing remains an issue, but now in the opposite direction. Where the Rite of Succession felt too slow, the Dome almost feels too rushed. That does hurt the quality of the story in the long run, but it undeniably is more engaging in the moment. A story that moves too slowly risks losing its audience, but one that moves too fast only risks losing its meaning. Now, while Dawntrail's story has become the focal point of criticism, it isn't the root of the problem. It's the point where a number of long-standing issues finally become impossible to ignore. Issues that were easier to overlook when everything else was working, but were exposed the moment the foundation was put under real pressure. And the most relevant of these, when it comes to the story itself, is the structure of the main story quest. Since Heavensward, Final Fantasy XIV has adhered to essentially the same MSQ formula. The vast majority of quests consists of traveling between NPCs for story beats, occasionally broken up by a solo instance. Dungeons and trials are almost always placed at predictable level intervals. By level 93, you know a dungeon and trial are coming soon. If you reach level 97 without seeing the second trial, you can almost be certain the final two will be placed back to back at the very end. And when the narrative is strong, most players don't notice or care about this predictability. At worst, it slightly softens the weight of certain moments. But in general, strong storytelling usually compensates for the structure's rigidity. The problem is that when players are less engaged with the narrative, the cracks in that structure become impossible to ignore. Aspects people once begrudgingly accepted begin to feel heavier and heavier, further weighing down the experience. And there is no better example of this than Final Fantasy XIV's questing. At its core, the MSQ functions much closer to a visual novel than a traditional RPG. The vast majority of the player's time is spent watching cutscenes or reading dialogue, with combat almost entirely reserved for dungeons and trials, content that appears infrequently at fixed intervals. The result is that there are often extremely long stretches where players aren't really playing the game. This is especially noticeable at the start of an expansion, where it's entirely possible to go an hour or more without doing much beyond moving between NPCs and clicking through dialogue. And once again, when the story is compelling, this structure largely fades into the background. But when the narrative fails to engage, players are left with hours of mandatory dialogue standing between them and actual gameplay. At that point, the issue isn't just the story. It's that the quests themselves aren't providing an interactive experience. Instead of reinforcing the narrative through play, the MSQ asks players to passively endure it. This not only hurts pacing, especially early on, but can actively lessen the impact of key moments. A clear example of this is the train assault, which many players criticized for being presented entirely as a cutscene rather than a solo instance. Allowing players to participate in that sequence would have given the moment far more weight. It was also the perfect opportunity to experiment. Rather than a traditional combat encounter, the scene could have incorporated the Air Force One minigame, creating an unexpected experience that reinforced both tension and spectacle. And this approach has worked before. In fact, the previous expansion demonstrated exactly how effective it can be. The problem is that the MSQ structure is fundamentally rigid, a system that has remained largely unchanged for over a decade. For years, that rigidity was masked by the strength of the stories being told. But as Final Fantasy XIV enters a new narrative arc, one that by design returns to lower stakes and foundational storytelling, those structural weaknesses are no longer hidden. They've been exposed. The structure of the MSQ didn't suddenly get worse in Dawntrail. Dawntrail simply removed the safety net that has been holding it up, and when that happened, the cracks in the system didn't just become visible, they actively compounded the expansion's storytelling problems. That isn't a failure unique to Dawntrail. It's a systematic issue that the game itself now has to confront. While Dawntrail's story became the most visible point of criticism, it was by far the only issue players took with the expansion. Much like the structure of the MSQ, many of the frustrations directed at Dawntrail weren't born with it, they were inherited. Problems that have existed for years, compounding over time until they could no longer be ignored. And no issue embodies that reality more clearly than job homogenization. The history of Final Fantasy XIV's job system is, to put it lightly, complicated. Each expansion has brought significant changes, often in response to the problems of the one before it. Heavensward pushed the original job system to its absolute limit. Job expression and mechanical complexity were at their highest, but that depth came at a cost. Balance during Heavensward was among the worst the game has ever seen, with massive gaps in performance between jobs. Stormblood attempted to correct this. It refined the system, significantly improved balance, and crucially, managed to preserve job identity. It also marked the end of the cross-class system, replacing it with the role actions. The real turning point came with Shadowbringers. This is where the underlying problems began to take shape. Shadowbringers removed TP, damage stances, resistances, and made a variety of other changes. It also introduced job gauges across every role, many of which ultimately served very similar purposes. By the end of Shadowbringers and leading into Endwalker, dissatisfaction with job homogenization began to gain real momentum, and the primary catalyst was cooldown standardization. Almost everything was now aligned to 1 or 2 minute windows, giving rise to what players now refer to as the 2-minute meta. And the issues only intensified going into Endwalker. The 2-minute meta already made many jobs feel interchangeable, but further simplification pushed some even closer together or removed what made others feel unique. Ironically, Dawntrail is the expansion that made the fewest changes to the job system. It largely just built on what Endwalker had already established. And that's the core of the frustration. The problem with jobs in Dawntrail isn't that they became worse. It's that nothing was done to fix what players were already unhappy with. Now, job design wouldn't be the only lingering frustration plaguing the expansion. Beyond how classes played, players also grew increasingly vocal about what they perceived as a lack of content. This frustration didn't come out of nowhere. Coming off of Endwalker, many players already felt burned by what was widely seen as a content drought, particularly due to the absence of a field operation and a meaningful relic grind. Going into Dawntrail, that concern only intensified. But this wasn't simply because Dawntrail offered less to do. It was a result of two factors colliding at the worst possible moment. For many players, the Dawntrail MSQ was no longer enough to justify their time on its own. And when the story stopped carrying the experience, players naturally looked for other reasons to log in, and felt they weren't being given them. As a result, even the game's once praised patch cadence came under scrutiny. Players began calling for faster patches, more frequent updates, and denser content drops. Anything that could justify continued engagement. But here's the thing. That isn't the real issue. In reality, Final Fantasy XIV has received a wide variety of new content over the past several expansions, much of which has been wildly praised, often described as some of the best encounter design the game has ever produced. The problem, then, isn't a lack of content. It's how that content is handled. The central issue with these newer additions is their lack of longevity. Criterion and Quantum in particular suffer from a near total absence of meaningful rewards. Once players clear them, there's little incentive to return, turning what could have been evergreen content into a one-and-done experience. Chaotic did attempt to address this by offering incentives for repeated clears and for helping other players, but in practice, The logistical barrier for organizing 24 players, combined with the punishing nature of the fight, made them inaccessible to much of the player base. Instead of thriving in Party Finder, Chaotic quickly was relegated to Discord content. So, no. The problem isn't that Final Fantasy XIV needs more content faster, it needs more content that lasts longer. And we already have clear examples of this working right now in the game. Eureka, for instance, has remained remarkably active for years, whether through the communities that have formed around it or new players chasing its coveted rewards. It continues to pull players back in. Its content players can spend months engaging with, grinding relic weapons, working toward armor sets, and steadily progressing toward tangible goals. And crucially, it's content you can log into and play immediately. You don't need to organize a group. You don't need to wait on Party Finder. You just log in and start making progress. That sense of forward momentum is key. There's always a goal in sight. And because of that, the grind feels justified rather than exhausting. And it can't be overstated just how valuable that kind of login content is to many players. Fishing is another perfect example. It's content with a dedicated, long-term audience who log in specifically to fish. And unlike Eureka, there isn't some legendary piece of gear locked behind it. The rewards are mostly titles. But that doesn't matter. What does is that there's still a goal to work toward, and a genuine sense of accomplishment when it's finally achieved, especially when you land a rare fish you've been chasing for months. These systems work not because they're fast or flashy, but because they give players a reason to come back. And this is exactly why something like Occult Crescent became such a point of frustration. Without a Castrum equivalent, there was little for more casual players to work toward. And because it couldn't be used to level, unlike Bosja, it offered very little reason to return once its novelty wore off. By contrast, Pilgrim's Traverse was far better received. Its structural changes, most notably the additional checkpoints, made it significantly more approachable and replayable than previous deep dungeons. Add in the weekly challenges that contribute towards rewards, along with strong experience gain, and it became content players wanted to engage with more over time. As a result, Pilgrim's Traverse ended up having far more longevity than many players would have initially expected. When it comes to job and content design, the reality is simple. This isn't a Dawntrail problem. It's a Final Fantasy XIV problem. And if nothing changes in the next expansion, these same complaints will surface again, regardless of how strong the story is. But if these systems are reworked in ways players genuinely enjoy, many of the current frustrations will fade overnight. So when people eventually look back on Dawntrail, the story will likely remain a point of contention. But these structural issues won't be remembered as failures of the expansion. In fact, they likely won't be remembered at all. With the major criticisms of Dawntrail laid out, we finally return to the core question. Is Dawntrail really as bad as people make it out to be? Put simply, no. While the story is undeniably a misstep, it isn't the disaster it's often portrayed as. At its worst, the base narrative settles comfortably into a 7 out of 10. Flawed, uneven, but far from irredeemable. When you factor in the post-patch story, which was received far more positively, that assessment inches upward, but it still never reaches the heights Final Fantasy XIV has set for itself. In the end, Dawntrail's story lands somewhere between a C and a C+. And that's fine. It's a passing grade. But coming off the strongest storytelling the game has ever delivered, it's also understandably disappointing. And in many ways, that disappointment was inevitable. There was never a realistic scenario where Dawntrail's story could live up to Shadowbringers or Endwalker, because it was never meant to be a payoff. It was always meant to be a beginning. That doesn't excuse its missteps, but it does add important context. Expectations going into Dawntrail were incredibly high, sometimes unrealistically so. And when the story failed to meet those expectations, the fall was steep. that disappointment hardened into resentment, and in many cases, that resentment colored the perception of the entire expansion. But here's the thing. As time passes, and we gain distance from Dawntrail's launch, opinions will soften. Those who hated it will begin to acknowledge its strengths, and those who loved it will start to see its flaws more clearly. And while Dawntrail's story will never be remembered fondly, the expansion as a whole very well might be. Because when people look back, they won't just see a weak narrative. They'll also remember improved glamour, meaningful quality of life changes, and ambitious new content like Chaotic and Quantum that, once refined, have the potential to become cornerstones of the game's future. Dawntrail will also be remembered for delivering some of the best designed encounters in the game's history in one of its strongest raid tiers. And despite the story's flaws, it has laid an interesting foundation for the next chapter of Final Fantasy XIV. Whether that foundation ultimately pays off remains to be seen, but the most recent patch has already left players far more optimistic about where the narrative is heading next.